Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go!
Some background on me. I joined the United States Air Force right after high school. I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do with my life, but my dad had served, and it seemed like a good way to get some structure and see the world. I ended up in security forces, which is basically the Air Force's version of military police. Most of what we did was gate security and base patrols, but at my England assignment, I finally got to do more actual police work. Every base has its own culture and traditions. One of ours was morale shirts that we could wear on Fridays instead of our standard uniform tops. Each unit claimed a color. My first unit wore navy blue shirts, my second had olive drab green, and my third unit, the one I was in during the story, had black shirts. We only ordered them every 3 months, and they took forever to arrive since we were overseas in Europe. While waiting for the official unit shirts, we could wear plain black t-shirts or military black shirts from other sources. I usually wore my Police Week shirt since I was in security forces. It wasn't our official unit shirt, but it actually made it more obvious I was security because instead of our unit symbol, it had our badge on the chest. This particular night, I was working the graveyard shift at the Base Defense Operations Center, BDOC, which is basically our dispatch desk. It was around 2 a.m. and I was in the middle of a PUBG mobile game when this woman stormed in. One look at her and I knew exactly what we were dealing with. A military dependent, spouse, with those crazy long fake nails. A classic Karen haircut with the back dyed pink. She was livid about high school kids having a party down the street off base that was keeping her awake. Here's the thing. This was England, where the drinking age is 18, and it was graduation weekend. This wasn't even in our jurisdiction, but she was causing such a scene that they set me out to calm her down and politely tell her to contact the local police instead. I walked out without my uniform jacket, so I was just in my uniform pants with my black Police Week t-shirt and my sidearm. This wasn't unusual for us working the night shift inside the building. As soon as she saw me, she lost it. She immediately demanded to speak to my manager, expressing disbelief that they would send an intern to deal with her problem. I tried to correct her misunderstanding by explaining that I wasn't an intern but actually security forces personnel. She accused me of lying, pointing out my lack of visible rank and proper uniform, and dismissing me as just some kid answering phones. I told her of my E4 status with over 3 years of service and explained that I was wearing an authorized black t-shirt for night duty. I then attempted to address her noise complaint. She cut me off, saying she didn't care about my excuses. She angrily described the situation as underage drinkers having a party and demanded immediate arrests. I patiently explained that the location was off base and outside our jurisdiction, advising her to contact the local constables for noise complaints in that area. This answer didn't satisfy her. She complained that this wasn't good enough and called us useless, questioning what taxes were for if we wouldn't do our job. I reiterated that it literally wasn't my job since the disturbance wasn't on base property. At this point, she threatened to call her husband, boasting that he was an E5 and implying I would face consequences once he heard about the situation. I couldn't help but smirk a little at that threat. An E5 isn't exactly high-ranking enough to strike fear into anyone's heart, especially since I didn't work for him anyway. I told her she was welcome to call her husband, but noted that it wouldn't change our jurisdiction limitations. That's when she completely lost it. The woman actually slapped me across the face. Hard. Her eyes went wide the moment she did it. I think that's when it finally clicked for her that I wasn't some random kid playing dress-up. I was actual security forces, and she had just assaulted me. In one smooth motion, I reached behind my back for my emergency set of handcuffs. I always kept an extra pair at the small of my back in addition to the ones on my gear. I told her that she was being detained for assaulting a military police officer and requested she put her hands behind her back. She responded by questioning if I knew who her husband was. I reminded her that yes, he was an E5, as she had already mentioned, and repeated my request for her to put her hands behind her back. She started crying as I cuffed her, but there was no getting out of this one. I brought her back into the BDOC. Funny how she finally got her wish to come inside the restricted area, and we called her husband. When he showed up 30 minutes later, he didn't look angry. He looked mortified. Turned out this wasn't the first time she'd caused problems on base. He apologized profusely for his wife's behavior and asked about the charges. I told him that she was being charged with assault on military personnel and that we had already contacted the first sergeant. He expressed concern about how this incident might affect his career. I respectfully pointed out that it was his wife's assault on me that was affecting his career, not anything else. Karen spent the night in our holding cell while the paperwork was processed. Her husband had to call his commander and explain why his wife was in custody. I heard later that they were relocated back to the States shortly after this incident. I got to finish my PUBG game after everything was sorted out, and I won that round too. Over 20 years ago, I worked for a special government division in the UK that handled what you'd call cybercrime today. I wasn't your typical civil servant. I was jointly employed by the Ministry of Defense and the Home Office. Although we were a civilian organization, we all received military equivalent ranks based on our responsibilities. Mine was equivalent to a chief superintendent. My specialty was finding digital evidence that criminals tried to hide. This was back in the dinosaur age of computing, Windows 3.1, basic programming, and when computer experts were rare. No mobile phones existed yet, and portable communication devices were as heavy as bricks. Our team would regularly travel across the UK to collect evidence at crime scenes. We collaborated with various police forces and could be dispatched anywhere from Cornwall in the south to the remote Hebrides in the north, often with little notice. One particular day, I received a call from the Metropolitan Police requesting assistance for a raid on a property in North London scheduled for extremely early the following morning. By some unfortunate coincidence, I was the only team member available, so I got assigned to attend the raid. My job was to secure any computers found during the operation and maintain the chain of custody in case the evidence was needed in court. For security purposes, they confined me to the office overnight until the raid. Sleeping in an office chair is not my forte, so it was an uncomfortable and restless night. When we arrived at the address, I stood out as the only person not in uniform. I put on the standard white coverall suit, plastic gloves, and shoe covers like everyone else. I was escorted to a room containing several computers, some Commodores, at least 4 Spectrum ZX machines, which dates this story if you know computer history, and most interestingly a tower PC with 2 large hard drives. This was extremely rare and expensive at the time, immediately marking it as something significant. The officers left me alone to do my job. I had just started to dismantle the tower when I heard someone shouting from behind me. From the doorway, a Metropolitan Police constable loudly ordered me to step away from the computer. I was confused by his hostile approach. Still kneeling, I turned around to face him and tried to explain that I was removing the hard drives as evidence. The officer wasn't interested in my explanation and again demanded that I step away, accusing me of interfering with evidence. In hindsight, I should have explained who I was rather than what I was doing. Before I could clarify, the officer tackled me to the ground. I found myself face down on the floor with the officer handcuffing me while he yelled for backup. So there I was, wearing the same white coverall, gloves, and shoe covers as everyone else on the raid team, but somehow I was the one in handcuffs and under arrest. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, being handcuffed for the first time certainly made it seem longer, a police superintendent appeared. He recognized me immediately and turned to face the officer who had arrested me. The exchange that followed is forever etched in my memory. The superintendent asked the officer to identify himself. The officer responded by stating his badge number. When asked about the commotion, the constable explained that he had arrested a civilian who he believed was impersonating a police officer and tampering with evidence. The superintendent then asked for details about who I was and what I had been doing. The officer admitted that he didn't know my identity but had seen me tampering with a computer. He explained that when I refused to comply with his orders, he arrested me to preserve the evidence. When the superintendent repeated his question about my identity, the officer simply described me as an unknown civilian. That's when things changed dramatically. The superintendent told the constable that I was actually a representative from a government department whose job was to secure evidence for the Metropolitan Police. He emphasized that my rank equivalency as a chief superintendent outranked even himself, who was just a superintendent. He concluded by pointedly asking the constable what his rank was, emphasizing the significant gap in authority. The officer, now completely embarrassed, released me and helped me to my feet. The superintendent ordered him to guard the door, not move from that spot, and ensure no one interfered with my work. I completed my task, properly securing all the evidence, and left the scene. As I departed with all the collected items, I politely thanked the officer. The look on his face was crazy: embarrassment, regret, and the realization that he'd severely overstepped his authority. I was driven back to my office where I logged everything and secured it until I could get some proper sleep. After 8 hours of much-needed rest, I began examining the hard drives and tapes I'd collected. I discovered exactly what the Metropolitan Police were looking for, plus additional incriminating evidence they hadn't been aware of before the raid. The suspects were charged with numerous offenses under the Defense of the Realm Act. Our department never prosecuted cases directly. The Metropolitan Police had a specialized branch that handled court proceedings, regardless of where the crimes occurred. Whenever possible, our department wasn't even mentioned during trials. In fact, my boss's superior was the first in our department's history to publicly acknowledge its existence and reveal her name to the press. The criminals all went to trial and received lengthy sentences for endangering national security, along with additional smuggling and trafficking charges that were taken into consideration. I got to enjoy more than 12 hours of sleep in a comfortable bed the day after the raid, and woke up to the best cappuccino I've ever tasted. The officer who arrested me was assigned to traffic duty for the next 6 months, a fitting consequence for someone who couldn't recognize proper authority even when it was wearing the same uniform as him. I look younger than I am, I'm not particularly imposing physically, and I tend to be quieter than most. All these things combined made it difficult for people to take me seriously. When I got assigned my first official project management role, I was excited but nervous. The project involved about 50 people, most of whom I'd never met face to face since we were all working from home. We mostly communicated through emails and regular phone calls. No video, so many people didn't even know what I looked like. After a few weeks, we hit some delays in one of the sub-projects. I tried sending emails to the team responsible, but they kept ignoring my reminders. Eventually, I decided we needed an in-person meeting. My more experienced colleagues had taught me that when people resist doing what needs to be done, meeting face-to-face often solves the problem. I could have easily had the resistant team members replaced, but that wasn't my style. I wanted things to go smoothly without starting unnecessary conflicts. Plus, I honestly didn't have the self-confidence to throw my weight around like that yet. On the day of the meeting, I arrived a bit early. People were already in the room chatting, which I took as a good sign. A positive atmosphere would make this lengthy meeting more productive. That's when I first encountered him, the troublemaker. I'll call him the commander. I'd done my homework and asked around about him. He thought the project was a waste of time and beneath his skills. He hadn't volunteered for the project. It was assigned to him because of his years of experience, and he made sure everyone knew he was the best at what he did. Though he disliked the project itself, he seemed to enjoy the power of his position. He had several people working under him and reportedly acted like a dictator toward them. From everything I'd heard, he was not someone I was looking forward to working with. I walked up to greet him, but before I could say a word, he rudely cut me off. He told me he was busy talking and that I should just sit and listen. Then he had the nerve to ask me to bring him coffee. His tone was dismissive and commanding, as if I were some junior employee beneath his notice. I was so shocked I didn't know what to say. I just turned around and left to get the coffee, though I had no idea why I was complying. I needed a minute to process what had just happened. Later, my colleagues told me the confusion was clearly visible on my face. As I walked out the door, I ran into a young guy bringing coffee. He was wearing the same colored shirt as me, and suddenly it clicked. The commander had mistaken me for one of his junior employees. I smiled at the young man and complimented his shirt. After chatting for a few moments, he confirmed my suspicions. That's when I had an idea. I offered to take over his coffee duty, which he seemed relieved about. I took the coffee and went back into the meeting room. My colleagues looked puzzled, clearly wondering what I was doing. I approached the commander with the coffee and addressed him formally, handing him his drink. He thanked me, calling me Junior, but then looked confused and asked where the actual Junior had gone. He then impatiently asked about the project manager, mentioning he had important meetings scheduled after this one. I responded with a grin, explaining that the project manager had just been getting coffee, but would be starting the meeting soon. I left him sitting there, walked around the table, took my seat at the head of the table, and spoke loudly to get everyone's attention, announcing that we were starting the meeting. The commander turned around and saw that the person he'd ordered to fetch coffee was now introducing himself as the project manager. To my surprise, he just smiled. I could see he was caught off guard, but I could also read his thoughts. He believed that since he had successfully ordered me to get him coffee, he could continue to control me. That's when the war I had tried to avoid began. He rejected every idea my team presented as impossible. When asked what resources he needed, he made wildly impractical and exaggerated estimates. He criticized the entire project, the management, and openly questioned how anyone could have put someone like me in charge, clearly referencing my age and what he perceived as my weak response to his coffee command. It was astonishing how directly he attacked me, not even letting me speak. I tried to stay calm, and my colleague was really helpful during this uncomfortable situation. After what felt like at least half an hour of his ranting, demands, and personal attacks, I decided I wouldn't negotiate with someone behaving this way. I told the commander that we could end the meeting right there, as it was clearly unproductive. I told him that if he thought he could waste everyone's time like he did when he ordered me to bring coffee, he was sorely mistaken. I stated that I expected his results on time and would ensure his bonus depended on meeting those deadlines. I mentioned I had already scheduled a meeting with his boss, though I hadn't actually done so yet. I went on to offer his coffee runner a position with my project management team, noting that having the young man learn to make coffee was a waste of money and potential. I extended the invitation to anyone else on the commander's team who wanted to join, making it clear I wasn't offering anything special, just not barking orders at them and allowing them to actually do their jobs properly. With that, I stood up, walked over to the commander, took back the coffee I'd made for him, and left the meeting still fuming. Looking back, taking the coffee was petty, but I really didn't care at that point. I needed some air to cool down and reflect with my colleagues on what had happened and how I might have handled it better, perhaps without the coffee snatching. A few days later, the commander's entire team was working under my direct supervision. To get the project back on track, I kept them together as a team. Suddenly, deadlines were being easily met. Problem solved. I never checked what happened to the commander after that, and honestly, I didn't care. After years of saving, I finally bought my dream house last year. The biggest selling point was the beautiful in-ground pool in the backyard. I invested time and money to maintain it properly, and it became my sanctuary during the hot summer months. About 3 weeks ago, my neighbor from 2 houses down knocked on my door. She asked if her 3 kids, ages 8, 10, and 12, could use my pool since they couldn't afford one. Though hesitant, I agreed with 3 conditions. They needed to ask permission first, have an adult present at all times, and respect my property. The first week went well. She would text beforehand, supervise her children, and they were generally well behaved. But then the problem started. One day I came home early to find the kids swimming unsupervised. Their mother had gone to the store and told them they could stay until she returned. I sent them home and texted her about the incident. She apologized and promised it wouldn't happen again. But it did. I caught them in my yard without permission. Another time they left food and trash around the pool. Each time I confronted their mother, She dismissed my concerns with casual apologies and empty promises to talk to her kids. The situation worsened. I find unknown pool toys left behind, the yard gate left open, and even evidence they'd been swimming when I wasn't home. The final straw came last Saturday. I stepped outside at 7 o'clock a.m. to find all 3 children in my pool with no adult in sight. When I questioned them, they casually mentioned their mother was still sleeping. I ordered them to leave immediately and walk to their house. The neighbor seemed surprised when I told her where her children had been. I told her that after repeated violations of our agreement, her kids were no longer welcome to use my pool. She accused me of being dramatic and selfish, insisting they were just kids having fun. I reminded her of our arrangement and my responsibility for what happens on my property. She slammed the door in my face. Now other neighbors are giving me disapproving looks, apparently having heard a different version of events. Some have made comments about sharing and community spirit. Well, it's my property and my responsibility. I gave them multiple chances to follow simple rules, and they consistently failed. There's even a community pool 5 blocks away they could use instead of treating my backyard like their personal water park. And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.